most of you know who I am. I'm Gail Lechmeyer. I'm the Dean of University Libraries, and I have the distinct honor of being able to introduce our internationally known speaker, Heather Joseph. And just as background, although Heather really needs no introduction, she has been the Executive Director of SPARC, or the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, since 2005. And under her stewardship and her vision, SPARC has really become the leading advocacy organization for innovative, open, and equitable global systems of research and scholarship. And she has been leading SPARC's strategic work and has really led a fundamental shift in public policy, including the establishment of the landmark White House Memorandum requiring open access in 2023. She has provided guidance and advice to many organizations, including the U.S. Department of Commerce Data Advisory Council, to the National Institute of Standards Research Data Framework Committee, and I have to read these because there are so many of them. And she has spearheaded the establishment of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Roundtable in aligning incentives to support open science. She is widely respected as an expert on international open research policies and has been working on initiatives and consultations promoting open sharing of research outputs from the United Nations to the World Bank. She also has a background as having spent 15 years in publishing, both commercial and not-for-profit journal publishing. And I think that background really helps her to know the ins and outs of open publishing and open scholarship. And she is deeply engaged in global knowledge sharing in the community and has served on the board of directors of many organizations, including Public Resource to Our Research. So I'm not wanting to take any more time from her remarks. I will give you Heather Joseph.
Well, now I feel older than dirt, and also like, how am I gonna, like, who is that person you're talking about? Thank you so much, Gail, and thank you so much for coming to spend time today to talk about open access, open science, open scholarship, all things open with me. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to be here with you today. And you are the kickoff event for me for Open Access Week 2024. So thank you all so much. I'm going to talk today to try to give you kind of a state of the state of what's happening in the open space. And I'm going to try to do that in a relatively quick way so that we have time for you all to ask any questions and to dig into the myriad of issues that are, I think, uppermost in people's minds in the landscape. International Open Access Week's theme this year, as you know, is community over commercialization. And that theme was chosen really specifically and deliberately. And it is something that I'm going to try to weave in the reasons why we felt, and the community felt, it continues to be so important to emphasize the notion of who is the system or the systems that we have for sharing knowledge truly designed to serve. At SPARC, we believe that sharing knowledge is a human right? We believe that everyone everywhere should be able to not only access, but to contribute to and benefit from the knowledge that shapes our world. And we don't just pull that out of thin air, right? This notion that knowledge sharing is a human right is actually enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 27 really specifically calls out that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. To consider knowledge sharing as a human right requires thinking about it in a specific way and recognizing that knowledge isn't a commodity. It's actually a public good. There's a very specific economic way to think about and to address the imperative for knowledge sharing when you approach it as a public good rather than a commodity. Hence that theme, community over commercialization, right? That tension over knowledge is a thing to sell versus knowledge is a good to be shared with everyone. It seems like a semantic difference, maybe it's just words, but it actually represents a really fundamentally important difference in how we approach the challenges and how we can take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us to really reshape the way we approach globally sharing knowledge. And SPARC is a library membership organization at our heart, so we're nested in the academic and research library community. The library community, from deans and directors to scholarly communications librarians, from community colleges to R1s to anybody who is part of an academic or research library that wants to join SPARC, is a part of SPARC. So we are really nested in the fabric of the library community. And that's really where we take the focus for our work from, and where we kind of get the design for our remit from, if you will. When you think about being an advocacy organization to promote sharing knowledge as a human right, that's a ginormous challenge, right? And a humongous palette of potential things that you could do. So we really try to think about the fact that our end goal, our aspirational vision, is to support sharing knowledge as a human right, but we do it in a very specific remit in the research and education space where our library, our core members are nested. And we specifically support systems of research and education that are both open by default and equitable by design. And I'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. If you know SPARC at all, you know us as the open people, right? The open access advocates. And open is certainly a fundamental tool in our arsenal. And we love being known as open advocates and open access, open data, open scholarship. Fill in your favorite modifier there. But I do want to emphasize that we use open in a very specific way, right? Again, to attack this notion of advancing knowledge as a human right, working in the remit of research and education. We use open and the promotion of open practices, open policies, norms, incentives as an enabling strategy, not as an end goal in and of itself. It's a tool to help us achieve that goal in the space where we're operating. We don't promote open for open's sake, right? We're not interested in saying we need open access policies to provide open access to journal articles simply so that we'll have more open articles than articles that are under closed subscription. That's useful, but that is not the end game. So we really try to use this sentence when we think about the framing of the work and the advocacy. Oh, I don't know why that word was so hard. How many times have I said that word in my life? And the advocacy that we do, not open for open's sake, but open in order to, right? Opening up access to journal articles and to the underlying data in order to accelerate the process of discovery, accelerate the progress towards interventions, therapies, cures. We saw proof of concept of that, of the efficacy of that type of strategy during COVID, right? When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, one of the very first things that happened in March of 2020 was that science ministers from around the world got together and said, oh my gosh, we need a fully open database of all papers related to this novel coronavirus that we can have. We need access to that right now, no barriers, no payment. And we also need access to the underlying data in order to speed up progress, right? That in order to was a key thing. It was an aha moment for so many policymakers around the world that this is what we were talking about, right? Opening up access to research outputs in order to achieve something for the good of society. Opening up access to textbooks, right, in order to make college more affordable for a wider group of potential students. Also, opening up access to articles, data, code, software, algorithms, the tools that we use to do research in order to improve scientific integrity, help improve the ability for people to use and reinterrogate data that articles are built on, to do things, to ensure the quality of research outputs, but also improve the public trust in science, right? In a time when truth is fragile, it's never been more important for us to be able to have openness as a tool in our arsenal in order to help people actually kind of lift up the mysteries taken out, when you can lift the hood and actually reinterrogate where the data from where that conclusions are based on. So the idea of open is not an end to itself, but rather that a tool in our arsenal in order to achieve the kinds of changes that we want to achieve. It's a huge challenge, as I said, right? A ginormous challenge to even kind of wrap your mind around. And it's the kind of a challenge to enable sharing knowledge as a human right that requires systems level change. And so we have to think about the components in the system systematically. What are the areas that we really need to apply pressure to, the places that we have the biggest opportunities to facilitate change? And there's really three areas that we focus on, and that we at SPARC focus on, and that we've worked to help support our colleagues on the local level within member institutions and local communities, on the national level, and then more intertwined on the global and international level to focus on to make progress. And the three areas are really the areas of policies that underpin knowledge sharing and research and education, the practices that go along with that, and the norms and sort of community cultures that are attendant there. I'm going to unpack these just each in turn to give you a sense of what I mean. So, in terms of the policy and the policy environment, right? These are really the rules of the road that, from the very top level, kind of undergird, and I hate the word govern, but it is sort of govern, like what the expectations are for sharing research, sharing knowledge and research outputs in specific. And policy's tough, right? I mean, it's not an easy area to facilitate large scale change in, but over the course of the length of time that we've been advocating for open access, and that length of time is really now, what is 2024? It's 23 years since the idea of open access was coined and we began doing advocacy in earnest. Over the past 23 years, when I look back, I think the pace of change has been glacial, right? From going to talk to policymakers and saying, this is a journal, and this is why you should care about a scientific journal, to where we actually are today, which is, this is the area that I think we've made the most progress, the most visible progress, is actually shifting the requirements from mainly policymakers, who are the providers of the basic funding for scientific and scholarly research of all kinds. We've seen changes in the way policymakers approach their basic assumptions about what should happen to the results of research, to information that, in particular, the public funds. Although, as we can dig into a little bit later on, private philanthropies and foundations have been right there with federal funders, and in terms of their willingness to move along a spectrum to making open more of the default for policies. We have international frameworks that really kind of got jump-started in the very early 2000s. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development really, kind of helped to set that global expectation that information that's generated by federal governments, by public entities, is a valuable resource, and the benefits to society are maximized when it's available in a timely and equitable manner to all. We've seen that reinforced, in an ever more granular level, even on this international framework level, which is super important for national governments to, I was going to say grow a spine, but generate the will to change their policies, right? They need the exemplars, right, from above. So these kinds of frameworks may seem, theoretical and lofty, but that language is something that policymakers in countries will point to and tie their policy development back to. Those kinds of frameworks have become much more granular over time. In 2023, the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which really kind of took that overarching, open should be the default, and here are mechanisms that everyone should be thinking about. They really laid out a framework that included some important policy exemplar language. It was ratified by 193 member state countries of UNESCO. So that's kind of the tipping point for us, I think, in the international realm to say, open science has hit the mainstream. Open scholarship has hit the mainstream. This is the direction. It's going to be really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And certainly here in the U.S., as Gail mentioned, the chickens are coming home to roost next year for our national open access policy with the issuance of the OSTP, the Nelson Memorandum, which came out in 2022, which needs to go into be put fully into effect by the end of 2025, which essentially requires the immediate sharing of all research articles and the underlying data you need to validate those articles generated by the $90 billion in U.S. federally funded research annually. So the policy framework on a national level and an international level, if you had asked me in 2005 when, before electricity, when I came into SPARC, would we be standing here with this kind of framework? I would have said, I hope so, but I'm really not sure we're going to get there. But so this is very gratifying to see. And it's very helpful too, to see how the progress in terms of policies on the national level and the international level has been mirrored to a reasonable extent and to a growing extent on our campuses. Because the constituencies that matter so much in the research and education enterprise are so intertwined. Right? The federal funders and the policymakers, they hold a big lever, right? They can say, we're going to condition our funding for your ability and anybody's ability on your campus to actually do research with a requirement to do X, right? Maybe share your article or do X with your data. But universities, higher education institutions, colleges, community colleges need to be in sync with the federal funders rather than I should say, they don't need to be in sync. It's a better state when there's more, when there's less friction between the policies of a campus and the policies of a research funder. That's probably overstating the obvious. And we really have seen a growth in faculty-driven, faculty senate-driven open access policies on campuses around the world, as well as here in the United States. And of course, you all at FSU in 2016, were among some of the earlier campuses to actually put policies in place that really help facilitate the making it easy for researchers on campus, making researchers aware that this is a good thing to do, this is the policy that we would like to, the direction we would like to go in, and here are mechanisms that we have that can help you do that. So this is, I think, something that we see replicated campus to across campuses. It doesn't get the attention that a Nelson memo gets, but is a critical part of the policy fabric that has helped to make the advances that we've had so far possible. So the policy, that first area, I think we've made some really decent progress. It's been a little bit harder to accelerate progress in the actual practices of open sharing, even of articles. And I think that's probably not a surprise because it's much more complex to say to people, we need to change how you're doing things, how you're communicating, rethink how you are sharing the outputs of your research in this holistic way. You can ask people to think about changing it. You can have a policy that says, make your stuff open on day one. But policymakers don't like to be prescriptive and say, do it this way, because they don't want to be privileging one model over another necessarily. But unless a researcher, a faculty, a grad student, a person has a thing to do, something to hold on to, how do I do it? It's slower to take root. And I'm glad that Gail mentioned that I was a journal publisher because, I will be critical of publishers where it is warranted, and there is a lot of criticism to go along. She mentioned I work for a commercial publisher, a large commercial publisher, who shall remain nameless, Elsevier. Go ahead, Mark. Okay. Let me have it. It was 11 months. That was it. I learned a lot about what I didn't want to do. I think I'm going to say publishers, we kind of lacked imagination in the initial approach to open access, and the initial channels that we kind of offered for researchers was exactly the same journals that you're publishing now now in a subscription model, but we're just going to dicker around with the point of payment, right? We're going to not make people pay to access, but nothing else is going to change except we're going to shift the point of payment to earlier in the process. And we can definitely in the Q&A talk about what the attendant problems that came with these author side payments, article processing fees, and what we know about the net effects of that lack of imagination from the get-go. But I think that slowed a little bit of momentum in terms of really developing the full potential for what could open sharing look like in a practice mode. And we really needed to ask ourselves earlier, not how do we kind of tinker around the edges of how scholars and scientists are sharing research now, and to look more holistically and ask the questions, how do they want to share the outputs of their research? Because what we really see is when you ask that question, the answer is never, well, I want to wait, pick a small problem that I know I can get a paper out of, do the research, hold on to that research, submit it to a journal, wait 2 years, and then get an article where I get credit for this little tiny thing. They want to share early. They want to share often, and they want it out there. They want their colleagues to have it. They want their colleagues' research. They want that access, and they want recognition for it. So the opportunity for us to provide an increasing variety of channels is there, and we're beginning to take advantage of this notion of early and often communication. So you'll see a call for increasingly calls for opportunities to share research at every phase of the research life cycle. And it can be something like preprints, which people are familiar with. Again, this is really tied to the traditional journals, right? This is just an earlier version of the article that you may publish in a journal. But it's not limited to that. And I think what we're really seeing now are opportunities for the order of things also to change. So we're seeing opportunities for people to publish methodologies, to put up, an interesting data set with an annotation that they want comments on, pieces of information that are gathered, outputs that don't look anything like an article that you want to share and to communicate with the community. We're also saying, one of the big concerns when you open up a process like this is, well, if you just dump everything out and communicate it openly with people, how are we going to know what's good and what's not good? How do we get the quality signals? How do we get the priority signals? So we're seeing all kinds of experimentation now finally coming out with models that are called publish, review, curate models, which kind of flip that order of what I really want to do is tell you what I found. And then I want to get the opinions of, is this good, right? I want the validation, right? That review function. And then that prioritization, the curation. To whom is it important and to what magnitude? Things that the signals that journals generally are the only mechanism that we have to send in the community. We're beginning to see opportunities for researchers to apply this at every set of the research process. So really looking at a much more robust set of opportunities for researchers to enable this sort of life cycle communication process. That comes along with also the attendant challenge, right, which goes back to our OA week theme of how do you support, how do you pay for this kind of system, right? We knew how to pay for journals with subscriptions when we were simply changing the point of payment for open access journals to author side models. At least it looked familiar. Now it looks completely different, right? We have a life cycle model that we have things that are not necessarily individual packages like articles that we want to support, but rather a continuous communication cycle. This kind of harkens back to the idea that what we're doing is not looking to support the communication of research outputs as commodities, but facilitating the communication of research outputs as a public good. So we're paying for a process rather than a product. And that's, I think, a really important tie back to the Open Access Week theme of what do we mean by community over commercialization? Community wants to share early and often. We need to figure out how to shift points of payments or payment models or financial streams to support this kind of a shift. So we've got a whole bunch of, I think, options on a matrix that my colleagues Raim Crow and Mariana Garcia put together this really nice kind of spectrum to help us think through different kinds of points of payment when we're shifting from individual article packet kinds of payments to more collective, holistic models. So when we think about moving from a fully commercial system of scientific communication to one that supports the communication of knowledge as a public good, we really have to think about collective models, much, much more intertwined subsidies and subvention kinds of things on not just local, but national and international levels. And we can dig into specifics if folks have questions, because I'm sure folks have questions in the Q&A. But again, this really ties back to the OA Week theme of treating knowledge as a public good rather than as a commodity. Those two areas, all great, right? We see progress, right? We're untying the Gordian knot like piece by piece. The hardest part by far for us to attack, I think, as a community and as individuals, has been the area of norms, because we can provide, new policies that say we recommend, we require that you do this. We can give researchers, faculty, students the outlets to do it, but unless they are rewarded and incentivized in the same meaningful ways for these new behaviors as they are for continuing old behaviors, they go nowhere. So this notion of what behaviors and outputs need to be incentivized and rewarded in order to make this kind of a system fly has been central. And that's a really tough nut to crack, because you can't change it with a policy. I mean, you can say you must do X, but unless that policy comes hand in glove with the ability for a researcher to say, okay, my funder is requiring me to share I got funding from the Gates Foundation, they're requiring everything open on day one, but my tenure and promotion committee in the plant biology department says publish in Science, Nature, or Cell, or that it doesn't count as much. The researcher should never be in this position. So the real exigencies, the focus, the pain points in terms of advocacy right now are really around how do we change the incentives? How do we realign them to support the behaviors that we want to incentivize? And the point I just wanted to make sure that we're really clear on here, which really exacerbates the problem, is that the system of rewards for scientific and scholarly communication now is really misaligned, right? We've conflated unnecessarily rewarding the communication of science or research with the conferral of prestige. Like, if I post a preprint, if I decide I've got an article and I post it on bioRxiv, am I going to be rewarded by a funder or by my tenure and promotion committee in the same way as if I took that same article and communicated it by publishing it in Science? Absolutely not, right? It's completely different. But I'm doing the same thing. I'm communicating it. You're not rewarded for that act of communication. You're rewarded for the prestige conferred by the outlet that you're communicating through. And that's a really tough nut to crack. If it were simply, we just shift the point of, no, it doesn't matter where it's published, right? We have to change the perception of the value of what is being valued, from the name of a journal, the impact factor of a journal, to what is it that we're actually rewarding. Have you read the article? I mean, I know many tenure and promotion committees, we all do our jobs, we read them vigilantly, but really we're not rewarded for the content or the communication. We're rewarded for that package. And that, I think, is, we're struggling to make progress in this arena. And I'll say this because I'm in a room full of many of you who are fellow library folks. Libraries have about this much moral authority and standing to change tenure and promotion practices on campus. We have even less to tell funders what to do about it. So the strategies for making change, parallel change along with policies, we can move those policymakers. We figured out how to do it. Working in concert with, really good folks in the publishing world and researchers and really innovative people who want to create new outlets to create new mechanisms for practices to change. There we're doing pretty good. Moving the needle on this is much harder. But all is not lost, I should say. Despite the fact that it's a harder problem to solve, it's a longer time horizon problem, and it really has required us to say we have to activate people who have a different standing than we do at SPARC in the library community. Who are the people that control the levers of power in this situation? And really the communities that are the two prime communities that control the power are funders, right, who actually have the ability to say, I'm going to require a change in behavior from researchers, and university leaders at all levels who can say, we are going to shift what we value and reward commensurately in our research practices. There are more players, right? I'm not saying scientific societies who set normative practices are not important, or individual researchers or publishers don't have a role. But the two key lever holders to start with, from our perspective at SPARC, were really funders and university leaders. In order to activate those communities, we can talk to them as the library community and present them with, as much background information and try to catalyze action. And that's the route that we've taken. So at SPARC, we've worked for the last 10 years to catalyze a group of private funders, so private philanthropies. We've done our public advocacy with the policymakers, but really trying to move private foundations from the Sloan Foundation to Gates to Robert Wood Johnson to Arcadia Fund to coalesce around the idea that they not only need to do policies for requiring open research, but they have to actively work on facilitating a change in incentives. And they need to do that hand in hand with representatives from the higher education community. So we've also worked, and they have to be peers talking to one another. It can't be librarians to funders, right? They'll listen to us and they'll convene, but they needed to coalesce as a community that we do support as a library organization, but we kind of have those funders out there as peer influencers. We have a similar effort in the higher ed space with our Helios Open, which is higher education leadership in open scholarship initiative, which brings together people on the highest level of leaderships in academic institutions here in the United States. And you have really active participant in Helios in Mark Riley here. Thank you, Mark, for being our early support. First of all, for you guys who don't know, for those who don't know, Mark is actually an original SPARC, he's on our Hall of Heroes in SPARC, because in 1998, I think, or 99, Mark was one of the first faculty members that worked with SPARC to promote, we need to move away from these commercial publishers. This is just bad juju. We need to get out of it. He was one of the first faculty members willing to stand up and speak up. And lo, these 20 years later, you are here and you helped us to also galvanize and organize university leaders. So thank you for all the work that you've done and that you continue to do. FSU. It's seriously important that Mark say things to his fellow leaders in the higher ed community rather than me, right? I can be a messenger and they'll listen and they'll go, great. But I'm not a peer. I'm not somebody who's going to help them move the needle. They need a university president. They need a dean of a graduate school. They need the VCR for research to say, we're going to do this. We're committed to doing this. And they needed a forum. They need a forum to do this in, right? We need, what we can do as the library community and as an advocacy organization like SPARC is to try to provide those forums. So we convene these groups. We set them, we try to have them run themselves, right? There's university leaders, Geeta Swami, who is the strategic lead for Helios. It's run by the fabulous Caitlin Carter, if any of you have seen her from SPARC. She's fantastic. But Geeta is a face of Helios, right? And she's an academic lead at Duke University. Danny Anderson is an academic lead. He's the former president of Trinity University, right? So those peers are there. And in the Open Research Funders Group, we support at SPARC the convening of that group, but the funders have a coordinating council and run themselves. We bring them together under the auspices of the National Academies of Sciences in the United States in a roundtable where it's specifically constructed for conversations to take place between these two groups around aligning incentives to support open. So the way we got people to the table was literally to have the funders in the ORFG issue an invitation and say, hey, we're providing, tens of billions of dollars of money to your campuses and research. We're increasingly conditioning that funding to require open sharing because it's commensurate with our missions. We think we want to keep the money coming to your campuses, but we're hearing from researchers, I want to take the money, but I'm required to publish in X journal. What can we do? We want to have conversations. What can we do as funders and university leaders together to take the friction out of the system so the researcher is not in this impossible situation? So the National Academies imprimatur provides a really nice incentive for these folks to get together, to begin to come up with strategies, tactics, and places where you can begin to change the norms and begin to make progress. One thing I'll say is really interesting to me about this roundtable is that we thought we were going to get funders and university leaders together in the room, and they've agreed to get together because it's mission critical for both of them, and they're going to see tenure and promotion needs to be reformed on day one. And they all went, we see tenure and promotion needs to be reformed, but the strong consensus was if we start with that, we're going to fail. Because if the first time a researcher on our campus hears that we care and we're going to start incentivizing open practices is during their tenure and promotion review process, this thing's going to collapse. We actually have a better chance of starting change in processes where our faculty, our students hear early and often, we value the open sharing of research outputs. When we're hiring, it's in the job descriptions that go out, in new faculty orientation, where we tell you we value this and these are things that we're going to be looking for, in all kinds of different touch points where it's easier for individuals on campus in leadership positions to actually just simply insert language to signal what's going to be valued differently, and then have conversations with support from the top with department heads, department chairs, deans, which the locus of power on tenure and promotion is really distributed on our campuses. So this is a much longer term, I don't want to say it's not a forever thing, but it's taking longer simply by nature of the problem, I would say. But I am really pleased that there are initiatives like this that are out there. There are also global initiatives like DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment, where people are really trying to raise the profile of the need for moving. It's not just SPARC, right? Again, if it were SPARC saying you've got to change tenure and promotion and research assessment, we wouldn't be getting anywhere. Initiatives like DORA, there's an international initiative, COARA, which is a sort of a counterpart to this that are also really active. So I hope what I've illustrated is that there's plenty of challenges, right? This is systems level change when we're looking at really shifting how we approach sharing knowledge from a commodity to a public good, to really center the notion that as a human right, we're talking about doing this for enabling access, contribution to, and benefiting from knowledge to everyone everywhere. It's a big scale problem. There are also plenty of opportunities for actions, though, that place the needs of the research community and the public at the center as well. And I'd love to talk about those in questions and answers, and just maybe we can use the lens again of community over commercialization as how we dig into any aspect that you might want to dig into. So I'm going to stop there and ask for questions. And thanks so much for listening. That hand went up fast. Yes.
Heather, thanks so much for your talk. That was fabulous. You mentioned that the norms have been the tough nut to crack, as you put it, and you referred to the example of the professor who's deciding where to publish and thinking about what they'll be rewarded for. And then you talked about university leadership and the efforts to engage them in the effort. But from my perspective, I've noticed or heard that at that level of presidents and provosts, they're also in a similar bind.
Yes.
With the university rankings and these prestige organizations like
Yes.
AAU that are paying mostly attention to traditional measures of impact in published literature. And I wonder if you have any insight, or if there are initiatives out there in the world that you'd like to highlight that would help us to sort of like navigate those waters. Not that, none of us are, I don't think the president or provost is here, but, even just in trying to advocate on campus.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and it is. I probably should include a slide on it because I don't want to give the notion short shrift. Right, university rankings also embed, in many cases, requirements from your campus. 10% of research output needs to be in. They'll name the journals. Like, seriously, that is something that we do need to be. That does need to be. It is factored in, and it does need to be more explicitly factored in. I don't have a silver bullet, and I would, how to say this and not be wildly impolitic. So we worked really hard to try to engage the traditional higher ed associations. Some progress, some small progress and sense of openness to these ideas from APLU, the land grants, a little bit. Very difficult to make progress or even get on the radar screen of the traditional organizations. To get on their radar screen, they are so traditional that it has to be a member representative raising an issue to the leadership, the board, in order to get an issue. So we tried, cultivating champions who are members to do it. We didn't have success with that strategy. So in all honesty, the Helios strategy was an attempt to essentially set up a parallel structure where it's higher education leaders, but who are focused on this, and they're going to share the experiences that they have in terms of this is what we're trying on our campus, because we do have leaders in the higher ed community who are saying no more inclusion of journal names in your tenure and promotion dossiers, no inclusion of, for example, impact factors. They're isolated, and they need places to share that information and their experiences for how is it working, what disciplines is it working in, what is it not working in, so that we can begin to replicate. Again, it's peer leadership, but we had to build a structure, entice the university leaders, please come, please be a part of this. And now they have a convening space to begin to share their concrete experiences, which is why I say it's a really long-term play. Is it the only one that we should be doing? No. So if anyone else has ideas, all ears on that. But that is how that's been our approach at SPARC. I hope that's.
Yes. And Heather, and just on this point, there was a big meeting in Miami earlier this year where how many, 50, 60?
55.
Presidents and vice presidents and provosts were there, and we've just got to keep that conversation going and try and sort of find areas that we can make progress. I mean, it is frustrating, it really is, but I'm telling you, our provost and president and the presidents met with our open access board here, and it was a fantastic conversation, and they are open to good ideas and how to make progress. So we just got to keep, the conversation going and being as collective as possible, and that's exactly what you and Helios are trying to achieve.
Give Caitlin, Gita, Danny, that crew. It's not me, it's them. They're fabulous. But one of the things I think when I'm looking at you, I'm remembering is super important about Helios is that it's not a convening and everyone then goes away. It's those presidents are coming back in February. Those participants from Miami are coming back in February. And those participants, those presidents who actually did something are the presenters at the next meeting. So University of Vermont's president is going to present on tenure and promotion reform efforts on that campus. Like, she wants to share, right? So there's an accountability function and a sharing loop that's built in. And we asked them to share, don't just share what worked, please share what didn't, so that other people can start. I'm not a football fan, so I'm going to mangle this, but they can start on the, 30-yard line. Is that better than like some other play? Whatever. Like, farther down the field, closer to the good part of the field. But like that accountability loop and that, like using research methodology. Like you fail more often than you succeed when you try something in research. And yet we don't value, right, the failure, the quote unquote negative results are not negative results, they're just freaking results, right? Like share them so we can build on them and learn on them. So they're really trying, and we're trying with the roundtable to use that language too and that approach to say, if we don't set an exemplar for creating change by living the values of, communicate early, communicate often, what went right, what went wrong, learn from it, build on it, that's what knowledge sharing is all about. So that accountability function and that feedback loop is really what I think Helios is providing that we weren't getting from those other organizations, which do, in their own way, fine work, I'm sure. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. I wanted to bring something up, and I hope I can articulate this well. I don't come from the library space, so I may see things through a little bit of a different
we always hear, I'm not a librarian, and I don't play one on TV.
I don't play one on TV. I respect
I'm not either.
I like
yeah.
librarians. Some of my friends are librarians, but I'm a librarian. My thought was this open access over commercialization. To me, the connotation is that it's a better, higher, or that commercialization is maybe not the thing. And I take this, I'm coming from a standpoint of, I first thought about NSF. And they have the open access program, which is awesome and great. They also have the accelerating research translation program, which is to get people to commercialize more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like it's maybe they can complement each other because they provide things to be accessible and impactful. So just a thought about that, and I would argue that some folks in research would feel that too, that there's still value in commercialization, and just when I heard that was my first thought, that connotation came to me that that was a bad thing and this is a good thing, but I think there's a place for both.
1,000%, and welcome to advocacy, right? Where messaging is super important, and the Open Access Global Organizing Committee, they wrestled with, is it too simplistic to say community over commercialization? Mm-hmm. But we felt like it's a moment in time in the open access movement with journal publishers in specific, that's the context. Totally take your point that when you extend the Open Access Week theme into open science, of course commercialization is useful, right? And there's I'm not going to overgeneralize because there are people in the open access movement who think there's no place for anything commercial. In the research communication process, community control is paramount, and there's no reason for a commercializing the act of sharing knowledge. So for us, it was there's a pitched battle, honestly, right now for where are policy implementations going to go? Even here in the United States with the Nelson memo, we're fighting every day the commercial publishing lobby who says to Congress, defund implementation because we don't like the fact that you're giving options for researchers to deposit a manuscript in an open repository. It should be pay us for an article processing fee or bust. And that's really where the rubber is on the road. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is oversimplification. It was intentional because of a moment in time.
Yeah. And I get that. I knew where you were coming from.
Yeah.
And with a lot of librarians, I don't know that they would have caught it the way that because I'm used to commercialization too. So I just wanted to bring up that.
We hear that too from VCs from research all the time, right? I was saying earlier that I have a variety of different slide decks and things, combinations. When I'm talking to I know I'm talking to just library folks who really want to dig into the weeds about what's going on. The deck has some of the pressure points of open at the intersection of data privacy, commercialization, security, national security, and AI at this moment, right? Where the questions that are coming up, it's like, open is not a panacea and it's not open or bust. So we have to think about what are we asking you to do open in order to? And it's not open or nothing for every kind of research output, right? there's no argument anybody's ever been able to make that says a research article that was designed to do one thing, be shared. There's no reason for articles not to be open. Data sets, data in general, absolutely. There's shades of gray and all kinds. It's the European Commission coined their approach, a decade and a half ago, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Of course it's a spectrum. Of course there are gradations. In different use cases, there are nuances, right? When we look at one of the major questions that we're getting now is, well, you've been advocating for me to share my article openly and use the most permissive license, right? CC BY license. And I'm doing that. But now with the advent of these LLMs and AI, what if a commercial vendor, somebody takes my article, my open access article, and uses it in a way I don't want? Or what if they're selling it and I don't get something from it? What should I be now locking it down? And these are the kinds of things that our steering committee meeting for SPARC 2 months ago, that was the primary question our librarian said, that's what we're getting from researchers is, I saw the deal where publishers are selling their article collections to, Microsoft to do training of LLMs and AI, different AI models. What if I don't want it? So we're having to figure out how do you unpack the threads and how do you articulate where the benefits are in sharing openly. So there are those kinds of tensions, or I don't know. This is the only way I know how to describe it is by doing modern dance, whatever. They come up a lot in this. Yeah, I appreciate it. Other questions? Yes.
I guess just following on from that, I wonder what you tell concerned authors when they ask that question. And for context, we've been noticing our institutional repository, I think we had an outage recently due to a suspected LLM company just going in and aggressively trying to harvest everything. And they don't even care if something is CC licensed or not. It's just if it's publicly available, they sweep it up. So I just wonder how you approach that when people express that.
We don't have the perfect answer for individual researchers. One thing that we have been doing is to try to take the approach of what is it exactly that you don't want to have happen? Can you give us the use case so that we can do the more specific you can be about what is your fear, the better we can understand what's the likelihood that is going to happen. And if it's not really a high likelihood, you can develop answers in one direction. If it's really a reasonable likelihood, then we can look at developing interventions for what does that look like. That's literally where we are as an organization. And some of our individual we had our steering committee meeting yesterday to follow up on this is the approach that we're taking, and we asked explicitly for our library members on the steering committee, please bring us any use cases that you get so that we can together try to figure out where to go from there. I'm sorry, the second half of your question was?
That was it. That's all exactly.
Oh, there was another half. Went right out of my head.
Repository that we're noticing increased harvesting traffic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've got to put limits on what can be harvested at any one time.
I think that's what
You can. You can try, but for every one crawler that respects your robots.txt file, there's 1,000 that don't, and they're just going to do it no matter what.
And that's the second half, right? So we as a community don't have norms, and we don't have best practices in place, and we need them. We're like everyone else, right? Trying to develop these things as this tsunami broke over our heads. So that is another area that we're trying to pay attention to. And it's also an unexpected benefit of having the entity like Helios set up and the ORFG set up is they're interested in those norms too. So, as definitions and normative practices start to develop, they're being driven largely, this is also perfect for community over commercialization, I'm realizing, they're largely being driven by the big LLM companies, right? Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, Meta, they're driving everything from, how this field is beginning to coalesce to what's the definition of, right? we're working on the definition of open source AI, because at SPARC, we're primarily interested in that intersection of openness and AI. That's our particular remit. If we tried to look at every aspect of AI, we would go nuts, but we need to pay attention to it for our community's research and education remit. The definition that's being used for open source AI was generated by Meta. So it's generated by a commercial entity with commercial values and goals, but also by an entity whose perception and use of AI are LLMs on a scale that none of our research institutions, none of our educational institutions are utilizing it or will be developing or utilizing it on that scale. So even if the definitional aspects of what comes out are okay, it's being driven with a very specific worldview and set of values in mind, and the normative kind of use cases or actions that can come out of it don't take into account the research and education community. So there's a push to actually develop an alternative definition of open source AI that's community-based and coming up. And it's kind of like the frameworks, right? When we talk about I'm such a geek because this stuff lights me up, right? Those frameworks are super important because it sets the parameters with it inclusive of the communities that we are all part of in higher ed and in libraries and research, not just the commercial players. Ideally, they meld together at a certain point, but if we're not at the table for these formative moments, the definitions of things will then not reflect fully the things that we want to do and the directions that we want to go in it. So it's really, you could run 7,000 miles an hour every day working on this stuff, and we have to. It's one of those moments in time. Yes.
Just building on Beth's point about commercialization. I think possibly a better word would have been exploitation.
Yeah.
We're not against commercialization, it's exploitation, which happens to start with a capital E, which then makes your mind wander to other places.
I was timing, how fast. Well done.
But another aspect here is one of the incredible heroes of publishing, and this goes back 25, 30 years, is Paul Ginsparg,
yes.
Physicist at Los Alamos, creating the archive, which has just grown and grown and grown. It's Cornell now, and I don't know if Paul's retired now. I used to serve on a committee with him at the APS. Absolute genius. And I'm just wondering how SPARC is coordinating or working with the archive to sort of further grow and make things even more open.
Paul's a hero. He's still, I think he's sort of semi-retired, but Paul will never retire. He's one of those live wires that will never go away. I'm really proud that SPARC was instrumental in developing the support model for financially keeping archive going from the get-go, particularly because my first job in publishing was at the American Astronomical Society, and we developed a prototype electronic journal in 1995 at the same time Paul was developing the archive. And I was so privileged to be super young staff person, I had an NSF grant with the executive director of the organization to do the journal prototype. When we talked about, do we need journals anymore, or will our archive be sufficient? And Paul said, we should just scrap the journals. And Peter Boyce, who was my boss, said, I think the two can coexist. They do two different functions. And when I think about that now, I think he's right. They do two different functions, because Paul was talking about communication and Peter was talking about prestige, right? That conferral. And I'm not in a bad way. Peter was the best boss I ever had and a fabulous person to work for. But those tensions they're long-standing in the field. So yeah. I'm realizing that we're at 12, and I want to be respectful of all of your times because I know you all have busy jobs. So I do just want to say thank you so much for coming today and for having me here. So thank you.